It's nearly a year since the World Health Organization declared what has turned out to be a devastating COVID-19 pandemic. Today we ask our global panel how the coronavirus has changed us. And you can join in the conversation too, obviously. I'm going to be focusing on family, work and community. Tell us about your pandemic experiences in our live YouTube chat. More than 117 million people worldwide have been sickened by COVID-19 and 2.6 million people have died. The pandemic is the most deadly since 1918 and it has changed our lives in ways that would have been unthinkable just over a year ago. Joining us to reflect on this challenging year is Tirusha Naidu. She is a clinical psychologist in Durban, South Africa. Shraddha Sidwani is also a clinical psychologist. She joins us from Mumbai, India. And Erica Felix is a psychology professor at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Hello, everybody. I am going to give you ladies one word. I want your instant reaction. This is my mood tracker. I want to know where your head is right now. Tirusha, COVID-19, first thought.
I think for me, the word unprecedented has really defined what COVID-19 pandemic has been about for everyone.
Shraddha, COVID-19.
Chaos and uncertainty.
Okay. Erica.
Revealing a lot of things we needed to look at.
Wow. Okay. Now, I know where your moods are at right now. Let's start with family life and how it's changed for you in the past year. Here's Jason's story.
I was one of the first people in the United States to get COVID-19. I had it last March, ended up in the hospital when I couldn't breathe without oxygen, had to go back to the hospital 6 weeks later with painful complications in my lungs. Wasn't till about mid-July when I really felt better. It took about 4 months to get over. It took a huge toll on me physically, also mentally. It took a huge toll on my wife, who had to take care of me that whole time. And one of the biggest ways it impacted me, it cost me some friends, people who even after they saw what I went through, still think this is all overblown or fake, which I still don't understand.
Erica, as Jason was speaking there, I could see you nodding. It was obviously resonating what he went through, and the level of grief in the United States as the US keeps counting the number of people who have died from COVID. What has that done to the country you're living in?
Yeah, the impact on family has been huge. The people most directly impacted, like your guest, and just having to adjust and adapt and take so much more on our plate, but also families having to change and adapt in living with each other. Like, I'm a university professor, our students have had to go home, and so families are welcoming back adult children that they thought had moved out. People have been moving from urban cities to back home to their family of origin just to be able to quarantine or shelter in place in places where they get a little more outdoor space. So it's just been turbulent, and the grief of just having COVID or losing a family member to COVID, but also of missed events, lost schooling, changes in jobs, lost businesses. It's been massive.
Shraddha, when I think about India, I think about how powerful those connections are with your family. The family is so core. Connecting with your family is so core. Then what happens when you have a severe lockdown and something like COVID-19? How has Indian family life changed?
So I think there are two important aspects here. Initially with the lockdown coming in, we saw 3 generations of family people staying together in very close-knit homes. So the levels of frustration, anger were very high because there were space constraints. And with the lockdown prolonging for a couple of months, we saw a lot of loneliness happening. So yes, we lost the connectivity. There was a lot of grief coming in. There was a sudden panic in the atmosphere. We didn't know what was COVID-19. So a large population in India is also, not had their formal school. So for them to understand what this virus is, it's very transparent. You can't see it. Is it actually true or no? And so there was a lot of fear, panic, and chaos in the community. So it took a lot of time for the government to sort of, help through social media as to, yes, this is the virus, we are here to save you all, there are masks required. But the entire process was, took a lot of time. Families, children went into online schooling. Most of the kids do not have your formal gadgets, your iPads. Schools were not equipped to go into online schooling. So unlike the US and all around the world, the education system in India is very based on a very personal level. And so a lot of schools took a lot of time to start the education back online.
Piyush, I'm just thinking about life in Durban right now compared to life in Durban a year ago. If you're looking at the family, what's changed?
Well, I think mostly it's been shifting roles. So moms that have to be homeschool teachers, dads that have to do different things, but very much the same as Erica and Shraddha's experiences. People have had to learn and change. But I think the difference with South Africa is that this is not our first huge social disruptive experience, in the sense that the pandemic is just probably in living memory the third disruptive experience we've had as South Africans. We've had a whole HIV pandemic in South Africa, which disrupted our lives and shifted family roles. And then most people in living memory have lived through a transition in apartheid. So I think South Africans are kind of adaptable and can do things on the run. But even this pandemic has, I think, shifted and challenged people's flexibility, how they're able to change and shift between community, home, family, and their different roles. I think the shifting and changing of roles has been the most challenging.
I would love, ladies, for you to listen to Mahira Desai. Shraddha, listen to Mahira and then respond right off the back of her video. She speaks about grief here. Take a look.
There has been a dramatic increase in complex grief during this current pandemic. 1 out of 3 Americans has lost someone due to COVID-19. Globally, traditional mourning rituals have been disrupted due to COVID-related precautions. Many even battle the guilt of having transmitted COVID-19 to the deceased. Still others lack the social support required during these trying times. These are some of the factors that have complicated the already difficult grieving process.
Yeah, I think I completely agree with her here, because in India, we are a huge country with different rituals, different castes, different religions, and each state and each religion has its own way of grieving. And that prolonged process or 12-day process of grieving is extremely important to heal. And I think with COVID, we lost that. Initially, you were not allowed to accompany, the deceased to the morgue, and that was extremely distressful for family people. There was a lot of stigma not to touch the body. What are the last rites to the body? And I think this led a lot of trauma in, a lot of lives. So I think losing that entire ritual, which helps the community to heal, to bond, sharing is healing, and I think we lost that.
I am going to talk about work next, because working in a pandemic and during lockdown hard, it's an understatement. Economist Diane Lim is particularly concerned about the impact on women.
So a lot of women's market work has been disrupted by the pandemic because women tend to work the human-intensive types of jobs in the human-intensive industries. So leisure, hospitality, health and education services. Those jobs, unfortunately, are also, or fortunately, tend to be part-time jobs. Women choose those jobs, especially working moms, for the flexibility in schedule. But those jobs don't tend to come with benefits because they're part-time. So they don't come with health insurance, they don't come with paid leave.
One of the shocking stats that have come out of the impact of COVID-19 on our lives is how many women globally have been kicked out of work. They've lost their jobs. This has happened from the US, this has happened in South Africa, this happened around the world. Erica, you start. What happened?
Yeah.
It almost seemed like in September, kids went back to school and mums didn't go back to work.
Yes, many moms have chosen or feel that a forced choice, honestly, to have to take care of their families in a way that doesn't allow them to work anymore. And just yesterday, our vice president was talking about 2.5 million women having left the workforce since the pandemic started and how that will affect our economic recovery. We've all tried to be very flexible with like Zoom things and trying to adjust work schedules, but the ultimate reality is that the caregiving role disproportionately burdens women, and they, especially ones that are in that sandwich generation, as we used to call it, in terms of having to take care of children at home, but also have responsibilities for older parents, and so it's such a strain on their ability to keep up their job. And so if they're the ones working part-time, they might leave and hopefully have a partner that helps, but it affects our economic outlook.
Yeah. Tirisha, pick up.
I think it's interesting. We've come across a term recently which describes this really well, and it's called she-cession, literally a recession of women from the work environment. And it speaks a lot to moving women and diversity issues back economically and socially. But more than that, I think, again, the shifting of roles for women and the gains that women have made in terms of gender diversity. And a lot of research shows that women, if they're more educated and better off, raise children better. These are gains that we're losing as a species, as a population. But in my own work, which is mostly with healthcare workers who are highly trained professionals, I've seen them having to cope with grief and what Erica mentioned of their being the sandwich generation, I've heard stories of healthcare workers having to put their parents in a hospital and then go to their own hospital and take care of COVID patients. So it's not just the work burden, but it's the emotional burden as well. And going back to the issue of grief, as a psychologist dealing with healthcare workers, and mostly women are presenting for mental health care at the moment, I have to say that we literally have to rewrite the book as psychologists, as mental health care professionals. We have to rewrite the book on grief. Most of our work that we know on grief comes from learning about grief post-war, or learning about grief in terms of terminal illness. But pandemic-related grief, this kind of global, pervasive grief, is something new. And as Erica mentioned, women suffer the greater burden. It's really on social, economic, spiritual, all sorts of level. And there is a term for it. It's a well-known term that I've researched in HIV in South Africa. And it's called the burden of care. It's really the burden of care.
When you say you're having to rewrite the book on grief, what will be in that book? What will be in those chapters that we've learned in 12 months?
What will be there is...
Erica's got a suggestion, Erica. What's in chapter one?
Go ahead, Erica.
Oh, gosh, no, I didn't mean to interrupt or anything, but I was just thinking grief is on so many different levels. Of course, we've had to deal with the potential of family members getting sick or losing loved ones, but people have also had to grieve a variety of losses. So losing a business can cause grief, the economic loss, the loss of dreams, like delaying education or other things people wanted to do. The grief over lost events, like we had students missing their graduation, missing proms, grief over not being able to get together over holidays. So it cuts across levels. And so we all can be grieving different things in different ways. Of course, the people who've lost loved ones have the most severe, permanent thing, whereas we have hope that some things will be restored, but grief cuts across a variety of different losses.
Tirisha, I'm not letting you off the hook yet. I do want to know what's in when you're rewriting the book on how to treat us as a global community, what would be in there? But I'll give you some thinking time here via YouTube. Shraddha, I'd love you to respond to some of this. Kat says on YouTube, small businesses are shutting down in Sweden. A lot of people are losing jobs. There's homelessness, mental health. There's staggering drug abuse. Governments are not coping. Liz Rainey is talking about how COVID has affected all parts of our lives, not just our working lives. She hasn't been back home to see her family in a year. And then Sai talks about the long lockdown having impacts on mental health, children and young people. It's like there's no bit of our life that we can put in a little box that hasn't been impacted by COVID. Thoughts?
Yeah, I think that's it's a very touching story because I think we can all relate to it. I've been seeing a lot of patients through the pandemic, and of course, being a healthcare worker, we physically had our counseling sessions. And I primarily opened my clinic because we were getting very, very high rates of teenage suicide. And, there was nothing that was globally done in India. Of course, there were some helplines, but you could see the depression, the anger among the kids rising. The rates of addiction have gone high. Also, I want to point out here, domestic violence. Initially when the pandemic, I think that's something that we need to highlight here. And when you're looking at disparity in terms of gender, women did bear and do bear a lot of that part of the violence. So I think that's where, especially in India, we have a lot of laws supporting the women, but those rates have significantly gone up. In terms of drug abuse, we've seen very, very high rates of drug abuse among teenagers. And this has been huge because they haven't gone back to school for a single day from the pandemic has started. They don't know how to cope. There are mental health programs through schools, but I think that isn't enough. Right. So I think there's a general loss of, their routine. And I want to point out here is, as a society, we were conditioned and we had patterns of living. And COVID, I think, shook all our patterns. I think different people coped in different ways. So to readapt took, everybody had a different coping style.
Tirisha, just very briefly, the first chapter in this new book that we are writing for how to cope with mass universal grief, what would be that chapter? What would it be titled?
I think it would be about dealing with multiple levels of grief all at the same time. It's very unusual to experience loss of a loved one, loss of a job, loss of a style of living all at the same time. And it's been quite common. We'll also have to talk about communally experienced grief. So multiple levels of grief, different types of grief experienced as a community.
So glad you said that. Yeah.
And also anticipatory grief. So seeing what's happening to others and knowing what's coming next. And we haven't seen that level of anticipatory grief as we've seen with this pandemic. But also we'll have to learn more about how to work globally as a community. And I'm glad you spoke about North-South relations because it's a particular area of interest of mine and how the world is really, the whole globe is really tilted to the North.
Right.
So all the attention kind of falls to the North. So it's a term I've used before, the Northern tilt. And we have, this whole pandemic has redirected our attention to how the South experiences grief. Like, for instance, global compassion is a thing that we have to think about as well. How we share the vaccine, how we share knowledge, how we worry about other people, because the more people that are vaccinated throughout the world, the safer we all are. So Northern tilt, global compassion, anticipatory grief, and multiple levels of grief. This is what we need to talk about.
Do you know what, ladies? I find it really intriguing that in the same way that we are having to keep away from each other, this pandemic has also, in some ways, united us as a globe. Let's talk about what coronavirus has meant for our sense of community. We spoke to Dr. Vikram Patel earlier. Have a listen.
I think the impact has been especially hard on adolescents and young adults, for whom the pandemic has disrupted all the key aspects of their lives, from making and meeting friends to completing education and finding a job. This is, of course, also the key phase of the life course when mental health problems emerge. The most important thing to address young people's needs is to ensure that their voices are heard and their aspirations are prioritized when planning how societies contain the epidemic.
Youngsters, children are having an extraordinary time growing up where you're not seeing your friends, you're not playing with your friends. Some heart-wrenching stories. I'm just thinking about the kids right now. Erica, for you, thoughts there?
Yes, I'm a child psychologist, and so I'm seeing many of the same clients I had before, and just how it's exacerbating like any existing depression, anxiety that they've already had. With adolescents, we know that the peer group is critical part of their development, as Dr. Patel had mentioned. And so not being able to see their friends is taking a huge toll on their mental health. And it's taking a toll on family relations because parents are trying to find the safest ways for them to get some social interaction or trying to make up for that. But it's straining on the family as a whole. And so I just see that families are trying their best. They're trying to persevere. I hear my adolescent clients trying to put on a good attitude, but it waxes and wanes over the course of the pandemic. It's a year on out. There's weeks they're doing better, and there's weeks that they are really struggling, and I'm seeing a lot more symptoms.
You know,
Erica,
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I just
Go ahead.
wanted to add something on this. And, I think what I really want to add here is the motivation level. You can keep up your motivation for a couple of months, but having stretched up your motivation without any external factor, without any external reward, has been a huge obstacle.
And I've seen that with school too. Mm-hmm. Sorry.
No, go ahead.
Just thinking about when it first happened and it was like a global community coming together, everybody seemed to be locked down. And so the kids really worked and there was a lot of accommodations for academics. But now I'm even seeing honor students who their motivation, you really hit on that. It's like they're now struggling and can barely make it to class. And people like the students are barely waking up for the Zooms or missing them. It's just hard to be motivated a year on out and to be motivated for online education if they even have access to that, which we know that there's been a lot of disparities in terms of the ability to access education that this has highlighted.
So here's the thing. We have spent over 20 minutes talking about our really horrible, terrible, really bad year. And I am wondering if there is anything in the last 12 months, right? Anything, rethinking, that we can take away that has been good for us, good for our spirit. We've adapted. I'm going to give the first word, though, on this to Imam Suhab Webb, who talks about what have we learned? What is the takeaway? Have a listen.
One of the challenges that the community that I serve faced at the onset of the pandemic was the loss of community. It comes in right before the month of Ramadan, which is like very communal in spirit. And then as the horror of the pandemic began to trickle down, led to the deaths of family members and friends and those we love, our inability to come together and support each other and be there for one another. And although initially that seemed as a formidable foe, I think many of us have come out stronger with a greater capacity to serve, greater empathy, greater investment, greater maturity, more wisdom, and to take things that maybe in the past we took for granted now that we're coming back as a community to really understand and appreciate their value.
Guess I asked you for a sentence to start with. I'm going to ask you for a sentence to end with. What have we learned that is positive in our pandemic year? Tarusha?
We've learned about the value of hope and adaptability.
Shraddha?
I think what specifically in India, we have destigmatized mental health through the pandemic. We have started acknowledging that compassion fatigue is a real thing, and that we can get burnt out. Yep.
Erica, go ahead.
I think we've learned that the human capacity to adapt and even thrive in difficult circumstances is strong. And I think we've learned priorities.
Thank you so much. Guess I really appreciate you. YouTube, excellent. One thing that I've definitely learned, and we learned on the stream, is misinformation and COVID-19. They go together like this. Let me point you into the right direction so you are never misinformed. Verified is a partnership being championed by the United Nations. You will find it in your search engine. Go there for accurate COVID-19 information. Thanks for watching. See you next time.